There we go. That's more like it. Vandread. True, Vandread is an old sci-fi mecha series, but it's decent and has its moments. The story is one of survival of the human race in outer space, and also one of people coming together. There are plenty of comedic moments in it, along with plenty of feels. The action scenes are okay, and there is fan service. After all, this series did come out in the early 2000s. The series does get dark at points, especially later on in the series, but one thing the series makes interesting is the dialogue between the men and women in the show early on, because in the series universe, men and women live on two different planets and don't really understand each other, which causes some interesting predicaments. It's kind of a social experiment in an early 2000s sci-fi mecha series. Okay. Now, first of all, I have to raise a bit of an issue with this guy's recommendation. A lot of what he says about Vandread seems to work under the assumption that it is the way it is because it's from the early 2000s, which nothing he's saying really sounds like it's indicative of the early 2000s. It's just kind of an anime story, a sci-fi anime story. I also think it's funny that he assures me that it has its moments even though it's old, when lots of old stuff is great. But anyways, the reason I'm curious about Vandread is that the time that I watched it in order to drop it, as marked on this list, was like 03? So 13 years ago? I saw like 1 or 2 episodes of this on Tech TV way back in the day, and just kind of figured I'd never get back to it, because it's never been a show that's been like highly acclaimed. It's not a show that a lot of people really love. I have heard good things about it over time, but mostly in the vein of, it's alright, it's an okay mecha series of the early 2000s. I think I tried to rewatch episode 1 back in like 2007 and just gave up on it. So I'm more curious about it now. I'm a much more patient viewer, if you can believe that. I know a lot of people probably think I'm unbelievably impatient, but believe me, if you saw me 10 years ago, you'd be like, what the fuck? So I'm curious to give it another shot, especially because it's one of the early works of Studio Gonzo. Gonzo is a studio that I have always been fascinated with. They were, as far as I know, an offshoot of Gainax of the late 90s, whom got really into digital effects work way before it was popular, and particularly CG, full 3D CG. All their shows have had tons of CG work way before the technology was good enough for it to look good. So all their shows have aged horribly, but they were always using what was top of the line CG for anime of their time, and I can't say it always paid off, and not all of the shows have lived very long, but they definitely tried to make all their shows have a distinctive visual style and to make them all sort of cutting edge for the era that they belonged to, which made them very popular in the early 2000s. Like, lots of anime magazines and shit were always singing the praises of Gonzo because of the fact that they were sort of pushing the envelope, regardless of what their stories actually were. And they had some great shows. They did Welcome to the NHK, which is probably their most critically acclaimed show. Gankutsuo, a lot of people love. Kaleido Star, a lot of people love. Last Exile, a lot of people love. A lot of their early 2000s content was well beloved. Full Metal Panic, the original series, is sort of divisive. But nonetheless, Vandread was one of their first shows. Now, in the late 2000s, Gonzo went sort of belly up. They lost all their money not long after making Saki and Strike Witches, and then just kind of dying and emptying out. Their people went to make Studio Gohans, and some of them went to go continue making Strike Witches with other studios, and everybody just kind of left. But Gonzo is actually still alive. They've still made a couple shows. They made Blade and Soul in 2014. I don't remember what they've made since. I think they made a show this year, but I don't remember what it was. Probably nothing all that special, but they're definitely like a shell of their former self. But, you know, they were known for taking some of... Gainax had this propensity towards, like, fan service and tit bouncing and stuff that they kind of, like, invented. But Gainax always used it for these deep, meaningful reasons, whereas Gonzo was kind of just about fan service. They really like to have tits in their show. They really like to have stuff just be pure, like, style over substance, visual splendor. Let's put as much action and as much fan service into our shows as we can. And I think Vandread was an early example of that. It's a show, a sci-fi universe where men and women have literally been on different planets for like decades and they don't know anything about one another. And all the women wear very tight shirts. And I distinctly remember, because I was young when I watched this, it was the first show I ever saw where the women's tits were treated as very separate. All of them wear shirts that like lift and separate, so all their tits are very far apart. And I remember being like weirded out by that because I didn't understand the concept at the time because I was very young, that tits would be far apart. That's what I remember of Vandread. So let's give it another shot. Okay, well, episode 1 of Vandread had a lot going on, and I don't know how much of it was good, but it was pretty interesting, and it had a lot happening, and it felt very long, and I'm very drunk, so it was hard to kind of keep track of, because things were happening so fast. But anyways, Vandread takes place in a sci-fi universe wherein men and women have been separated for so long that they barely understand one another's existence. They consider each other aliens. We start off from the perspective of the men, who regard women as these like man-eating, insane creatures. Women seem to be more fascinated with men. The main character is a guy who's trying to steal a mecha on the men's ship that he's a part of. And what's interesting is that he's apparently a third-class citizen. So the men's society has this sort of caste system going on. And they get attacked by a bunch of women pirates, which is sort of what sets the plot going. I found myself pretty interested with the dynamic of the men versus women thing. It seemed kind of funny. The characters all had pretty distinct personalities, and it definitely is pretty tongue-in-cheek about the whole thing. It seems like it's a semi-comedic action show, and I like that the cultures are so divergent that they really have no like real understanding of each other at all. So anything they're going to learn about each other will be totally new. And I think that'll be interesting because it's not like men versus women using the conventional like what we understand to be the differences between us. These characters don't even know what men or women are respectively. So like to them it's just a totally alien species that they're going to learn about for the first time. So I think that's got a lot of potential to be entertaining, and the characters seem pretty fun and wacky so far. I was also really intrigued with the show's visual aesthetic because you can tell that they were trying a lot of new things for the time. This show has so many different CG effects, like just on so many levels, where it'll be like fully CG scenes and then special effects scenes and just stuff that can only be done on computers. The show came out, I don't remember if it's somewhere between 2001 and 2003, but like you can definitely tell that for its time, it would have been doing all kinds of totally new stuff. Stuff that just had not been done in anime, especially in TV anime before, was being done in this show. So I feel like at the time this came out, it would have been kind of mind-blowing to watch, because a lot of this would have been stuff that just you would have never seen before. Now, what's kind of entertaining is thinking about how much easier it would be to do these things and how much better the things would look in modern day animation. Like, there's techniques used in this show that I could do in Sony Vegas in 5 minutes, but when I think about what the technology was at the time, it must have been crazy interesting, especially because there's no other reason they do these techniques in the show. There's parts where they'll be like, all these like moving picture-in-picture shots and like just weird little digital effects that like the only reason to put them in the show is that they would have been something that no one had ever seen before and would have been super impressive. Whereas today they're not impressive at all. I don't think I would say that it's aged poorly. Like none of it was so ugly that it's just like, Jesus Christ, I can't believe people looked at this. But it definitely hasn't aged as well as like just using the conventional techniques of the time as well as you possibly could. You know, if you were to look at a lot of classic late 80s, early 90s OVAs and movies, those would be things that did traditional animation so well that it still looks amazing to this day. This show is definitely trying untested techniques, and some of them are stuff that just wasn't going to hold up because the techniques are so new that they didn't really understand how to make them look good at the time. So they were bound to kind of age badly. But at the same time, none of it's like, wow, this looks like shit. It has a lot of energy to it. It has a lot of life. You can tell that these guys were really excited about putting all these new techniques to the test and trying to see what they could do with this show. And I think that really comes through in the livelihood of the directing and animation and the energy of the characters and the fact that it's just this very exuberant feeling story. It actually feels very Yoshiyuki Tomino. Like, it kind of reminds me of Gundam or of like Overman King Gainer or like any of the weird Tomino shit that's just like off the rails directing that's very fast. I will admit that from somewhere like 8 or 9 minutes into the episode onward, I totally lost track of exactly what was happening because the show cuts a lot and there's just so much going on, and I was drunk and having a really difficult time focusing on it. So at some point I kind of lost track of what exactly was happening, but I was entertained and I find the setting fascinating enough that I'm willing to continue with the series, and I'd like to see where it's going to go from there. I might not watch any more while this drunk because it's got a little too much going on for that. Alrighty, well, that last clip you were watching was filmed over 2 months ago. Because I was so drunk when I watched episode 1 and just kind of, was ambivalent about continuing with the show, I didn't end up watching it. I got busy with other stuff. But now, today, 2 months later, I sat down and I watched the entire rest of Vandread Season 1, and I really liked it, actually. It was a good time. As I kind of described in the part about Episode 1, it definitely had, in the first 3 episodes, this sort of Yoshiyuki Tomino, Gundam-esque, or Overman King Gainer-esque pacing, where it was like very chaotic, lots of stuff was happening, but I really liked the way it did that, where it was just introducing all these characters and concepts without actually, like, explaining them. It would just kind of, you'd watch all these characters doing what they were doing and slowly piece together, like, who each of them is, what their personalities are, what's going on in this world and on this ship and stuff. There's never in this entire show an exposition dump. There's never a time where they, like, sit down and just tell you what's going on. You just watch the scenes happen and you get it. And, like, for instance, and I appreciated this a lot, that they never explain what a Vandread is. Like, the word Vandread, you gradually realize it because early on they keep talking about the Vanguard mech that the main character flies, and then midway through, like, episode 2, his mecha combines with one of the girls' mechs. They're like plane things, and then you start hearing the planes referred to as dreads, and so you think, oh, Vanguard plus dread equals Vandread. And there's never a scene where the characters say, like, your Vanguard and my Dread have now become a Vandread. It's not until the last episode of Season 1 that someone says, like, oh, Vandread Yura has taken off. Like, and you know that's what it is. You know exactly what a Vandread is. Never had to say that. So the whole show's like that. It never, like, holds your hand. It just kind of just goes along, does the story, and you get it. But after the first 3 episodes, it becomes a lot less chaotic. It slows down a bit, and it actually reminds me a lot of Martian Successor Nadesco. The way that it has this sort of this comedic tone to a, what is mostly not, I wouldn't say a serious drama. I mean, Nadesco had a lot more drama and a lot more seriousness and was a lot more deep than this show is. This one is more of just a fun action comedic show, but it takes its, it takes its world seriously. It's not just a goofball, over-the-top show, It's silly and fun, but the world is very detailed, and the characters are detailed, and there's just enough going on that it feels right. It doesn't feel like cartoony. It feels like just a fun show but the plot is serious. And so when it does get serious, when it has its more pathos-driven moments or and stuff, and things get real, it makes sense because it doesn't feel completely out of place with what the show has been providing typically. So yeah, it's all around a good time. I will say that the CG mecha fights have not aged beautifully. They're definitely they're not boring because they're just insane. Like the CG mech fights, things move way too fast. It's a little hard to tell what's happening, but you can just kind of process it. But yeah, they're all over the place, and the CG quality, certainly hasn't aged the best. Not to say that it looks worse than like a lot of what's on right now. I mean, the reason that TV anime has crappy looking CG is not because of the technology so much as because it's low budget. 2003, the first Appleseed movie was out, or like the Animatrix was out, and these are things that use CG that was like, legitimately amazing to look at, and would be today. It wouldn't be top of the line today, but like, Vandread is a TV anime. It has what it has. Shows today would probably not have much better. They could probably mask it a little better, like mask how like bad the textures are by putting some kind of extra effects over it. But nonetheless, the CG is not great, but it's not distractingly bad. And because things move so fast and the action scenes are so intense and so colorful, everything's very colorful in this show. Everything's exuberant. All the character designs are very unique from one another. I really like that. It's easy to tell everyone apart and you figure out who they all are. I wouldn't say I memorized anyone's names or anything, but I could tell everybody apart and remember what their relevance was from a pretty early point. So that was cool. And yeah, I had a blast watching it. It was I really like the concept. I like the idea that it's men and women who have just been from different planets and don't regard themselves as the same race, I like that they did it by just having 3 guys who've been captured on this ship, that's being run by women, even though it's the men's ship, but the women took it over, this gang of female pirates. And so, it's got a cool dynamic that it's not this whole culture war. It's like the women are definitively in charge, and so like even though they have a more laid back culture, like whereas the men come from a very militant culture, they've got all the power in the scenario, so it sort of meters out like what can happen in the scenario. It's very well done in how it handles that, and I just found all the character interactions to be really fun, and like just the way everyone communicates is hilarious, and I love that no one knows what sex is in this show. It's really funny because in so many other shows that have like this rom-com element, I'm always, and you'll hear me complain about this all the time, I hate when the main characters clearly just want to fuck and they won't do it. Or they clearly love each other, clearly like each other, and they won't do it. And in this show, that makes perfect sense. Because the main guy and main girl, the main girl, is in love with the main guy from the fucking beginning. She's just all over him all the time. And he just, gradually realizes that he feels something for her. But these people have never even heard of the idea of a man and woman loving each other. Like, it seems so novel to them when it gets presented. Like, when the girl first hears the concept, she's like, oh my god, that's what I feel towards him. Of course, yeah. And it's like liberating for her to find out that men and women once loved each other at a time, but I love that they don't even know what sex is, because this show, it has a lot of fan service in it, but all the fan service is totally diegetic. It's never like we're just shoving the camera in some girl's tits, Granted, all the women wear ridiculously sexy, clingy outfits and stuff, but like, it's never like distracting from the action. It's just like that the girls are all hot, and that's why there's, and they do action stuff, so their boobs are bouncing, but it's like, it felt natural in the world, but the fact that the characters don't even like recognize it, that like the guys are just kind of grossed out by women in general, or if they do start to feel aroused, they don't understand why. And it's really clever in that way. And I'm waiting for the time, and I know it's going to happen, because there's a second season to this show, and I'm just waiting for when they all find out about sex, when they all discover it and figure out what's going on, and it's going to be hilarious. And I also really like that the show didn't immediately go for, because I definitely thought this was going to happen. I thought that the women were all going to realize that they've been missing out by not having men around. Like, that all of the women would immediately have a love interest, and that they'd all, like, hook up and stuff. And that would have happened if it was a bigger cast, which, again, is why it's great that there's only 3 guys in this huge cast of women, because in both of their cultures, it's... Well, I don't remember if it was true of men's culture, but in the women's culture, they hook up with other women, and they have babies with other women. They have, like, a way of doing that, whereas the men are all, like, clones. The women have, like, an artificial insemination thing they do, that they somehow extract DNA from one woman's egg and put it into another egg, and there's one woman on the ship who is pregnant from pretty early on. And, like, I love that that's still happening. Like, there's some of the women on the ship are with other women, and that, like, it's like, it never just is like, oh, men exist? Well, clearly everything we've been doing is wrong. They don't go that route with it. You have very natural romances forming with 2 of the men. The main character guy and main character girl are, like, obviously a couple. Like, that's pretty clear from the beginning. And there's sort of hints that a couple other girls might be into the main guy, and there's definitely strong hints that the doctor guy is gonna fall for the mechanic girl. But all of it's very subdued, very subtle. It doesn't just become immediately the competition for the guy's nuts. It's honestly, it's incredibly restrained considering the kind of show that it is. So yeah, I really appreciate all of that. I mostly have nice things to say about this show. There's a few things that are weird. I haven't decided if I like or don't like this. That the men's society, which we only really see in the first episode because, we've mostly been on the ship with the women. The men's society was very alien, where it was like this very totalitarian, caste system and stuff. It's nothing that hasn't happened on Earth before, but it was like, it's very much not what any current society is like, where, like, men are afraid of women and stuff, but then the women's society is, like, just seems to be pretty much just like ours, like the current state of Japan kind of thing, like, women's interests are pretty much like the stereotypical stuff that they'd be interested in today, aside from the fact that most of them are, like, pirates and warriors and stuff. But, like, they all love jewelry, they love makeup, there's a whole Christmas episode where, like, it's like women are just way into Christmas and they have all the same traditions that we have, even though this is way in the future and stuff. It's like Christmas hasn't changed at all for women. But at the same time, I think it's kind of fun that would be like that one culture would totally have a bunch of the old stuff from before, and the other one would have completely forgotten about all of it. So yeah, I'm undecided about that. There's also, like, a couple of weird character moments. The weirdest one is that there's the blonde girl who's one of the pilots, and there's this black-haired girl who, it's kind of implied that they're a couple. It's not entirely clear, but, like, the black-haired girl's always just kind of getting strung along by everything the blonde girl does. She just, like, tells her what to do, and she's like, oh god, do I have to? And then she'll do it. But, like, in the last couple episodes, there's, like, the women are all turning against the men, and they're, like, remembering, oh, you know what? They are our enemy. We're gonna fuck them, fuck them. And so the blonde girl says to her friend, like, that does sound like a problem. You should do something about it. And the girl's like, me? And then all of a sudden, she just, like, a fucking switch is flipped, and she becomes this militant anti-men character. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was a different character and I got them confused or something, but then she becomes, like, the leader of the anti-men crew. And at first I thought that it was going to reveal to be a joke that, like, that she was all doing it just because the blonde girl told her to, and that, like, once it was over, she would be revealed to have just been, she didn't actually care the whole time. But it didn't end up being that way. It was like this was really her character all of a sudden, was that she was staunchly anti-men. And I was just like, what? Where did this come from? Why did she transform like this? That was weird. But those would be my biggest complaints. Now, I'll tell a couple of fun little stories about being an anime researcher and watching this show. Because people ask me sometimes about how I gain my endless treasure troves of anime knowledge. Well, this is kind of how it happens. For instance, I'm watching this. I'm like about to watch the final episode, but I had to take a shit, so I go into the bathroom, and there's an Animerica magazine in there, and I'm like, this says GTO on the cover. It's probably from the early 2000s. Let's look and see if there's any Vandread in here. And sure enough, I find a review of the first DVD of Vandread Season 2. So I read through that, and it gave me some hints about, like, what the second season's going to be like. If I haven't made it clear, I only finished Season 1. And I probably will watch Season 2, because I did enjoy Season 1. I won't watch it immediately, because I was just... I enjoyed it. I wasn't, like, totally in love with it. I'm not, like, dying to see the end, but I would like to continue it. And it said that Season 2 goes harder on, like, the character development and gets a little bit more dramatic, which are things that I think the show is in the right place to do, so that'll be cool. And then also, and this is totally out of left field, I really liked the ending theme of this show. It's really cool, really catchy, and I like it. And I noticed it was by a band called Silk, spelled with a C, S-I-L-C. And I recognized that name because that's an artist who did my two favorite songs on the Boogie Pop Phantom soundtrack. So I start looking into Silk, and I end up on Discogs, which is a music indexing site. And they've got listings for all the albums. And Silk, it turns out, is a collaboration between this girl singer and this guy who's like the music producer called Mio Ken. And Mio Ken, who also goes under the name MYKN, which is another song on the Boogie Pop Phantom album, which is my third favorite song. So obviously all my favorite ones are the ones produced by this guy. So I was like, okay, I want to know about Mio Ken. So I start searching him, and I can't find any of his stuff. But then I randomly come across this video where, like, he's credited as the guitarist in this ensemble for this Japanese prog band. And the Japanese prog, it's by a guy called, like, what was it, Kenji Shiori or something like that? I'll put a link in the description. But, like, it was this really cool, like, shoegazy prog song, and I was like, whoa, what's this? And then I couldn't find any information about this band in English. Like, there's nothing in English aside from what's in the descriptions of the songs uploaded to YouTube. It was one album released in 1996, a 78-minute prog album, of which one song is 46 minutes long. The opening track is a 46-minute epic that sounds like Yes, and I was like... yeah, that's the kind of stuff you find when you just start looking into random shit. So I highly advise that if you want to find crazy, obscure, interesting, cool stuff, just constantly look things up. You hear a song you kind of like in an ending theme, look up who made it, look up who they collaborated with, and eventually you might just stumble on some incredibly bizarre thing that literally no one's fucking heard of except for whoever uploaded those things to YouTube. Because that's all the information there was in English. Couldn't find downloads of it anywhere. It's not available for sale anywhere anymore, But anyway, Vandread, good time. We'll watch Season 2. This was the first ever successful Second Chances board, so pretty cool.